Yes, hello, can you hear me? Yeah. It's really a pleasure to see so many people here today to this seminar about the latest book from the Guardian journalist Luke Harding. Thank you for coming here to us, and thank you to Fritor, who has arranged this seminar. Luke Harding, I don't know if you know it, but he is in fact the first British journalist to be expelled from Russia since the Cold War. How come you ended up writing a book about Snowden?
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thank you. Very nice to see so many of you here. Snowden is now in Moscow, so that gives me a certain kind of purchase on his story. But just briefly by way of background, I was posted as the Guardian's Moscow bureau chief to Russia in 2007, shortly after Alexander Litvinenko. I don't know if you know who he is, the kind of Russian dissident, was horribly murdered in London with radioactive polonium. So it was a pretty bad moment in British-Russian relations. And within about 4 months of arriving in Moscow, I found myself sort of plunged into what you could only really call a very badly written spy thriller. I was being pursued through the streets of Moscow by agents from the FSB, which is basically the KGB, wearing cheap leather jackets and brand shoes. And I had my communications hacked, and the apartment where I lived in Moscow with my wife and 2 small kids was broken into by the FSB repeatedly. Anyway, it's a bit of a sorry story, but this culminated in 2010 after I worked on the WikiLeaks disclosures from Julian Assange. And I co-wrote a book on that, with me flying back to Moscow in February 2011, being stopped at the airport at passport control when I handed over my passport. Actually, I think it's this passport. Yeah, this one. Yeah. And being told in Russian by a security guard, "Для вас Россия закрыта," which means for you, Russia is closed. And basically I was put in a cell briefly for about 45 minutes, then put back on the plane I just arrived on and deported, and that was the end of my Russia career. So in a way, I mean, I think it gives me some insight into Snowden's situation. It doesn't make me omnipotent, but I know the Russian state. I know the aspects of Russia I like, and the aspects I don't like.
Based on your profile on The Guardian, it's easy to see that you haven't been written a single story for the newspaper since August, so you have been spending the whole time now this autumn writing the book. Yeah, you began.
Yeah, you know what? I feel I'm gonna, after this event, I feel I'm gonna go and lie down in a quiet, dark place, because I've now done 3 books in 3 years. I did the WikiLeaks book, which was then made into a Hollywood movie, not a very good Hollywood movie, but it's worth seeing, The Fifth Estate. Then a book on Russia, Mafia State, and then since June of last year, Alan Rusbridger, as the Snowden story was breaking, kind of took me to one side in the Guardian offices, and he said, and I agreed, that this was basically a kind of historical moment, a kind of epochal moment, and that we should try and chronicle this, both Snowden's story, which is remarkable, and the story of the journalists who interacted with him. And so he actually gave me a code name. He called me Boswell, which is Samuel Johnson's biographer. So I guess that makes Alan Rusbridger the Guardian editor-in-chief, Samuel Johnson, the famous dictionary guy. You make your own mind up.
We're going to do it this way, that if you have questions during the talk, you must just raise up your hand. I've been warned by the Fritor that some of you are really into talking a lot and giving long questions. I will warn you, long questions will be shut down, because we need to keep this seminar going. We only have 1 hour and 50 minutes. But I think we should start with this. We are now in the basement of The Guardian, Saturday, the 20th of July. And here you see 3 editors in The Guardian destroying their computers. Can you tell me, what are you doing?
Well, I've been in journalism for almost, for actually quite a long time, more than 20 years. And this is the bizarrest thing I've ever seen in my life. And essentially, this was the culmination of a series of unhappy interactions between The Guardian and the British government once we started publishing this material initially from New York and from the United States, and then British documents from the British spy agency GCHQ. And initially, the government in London was, they just threw their hands up in horror. They didn't know what to do. They were slow, they were dumbfounded. And then they kind of pulled themselves together, and then by late June, July of last year, David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, secretly sent his cabinet secretary, so the most senior, most powerful civil servant in the UK, to see us, to see Alan. And he basically said, we can do this nicely, or we can go to law. And essentially, he was saying that if we didn't return this material from Edward Snowden, we would be injuncted. The famous British police would charge up the stairs of the Guardian and maybe take us all away in handcuffs. We didn't know how the scenario would unfold, but it clearly wasn't very pleasant. And basically, Rusbridger explained to the government there was no point in us destroying our laptops, because this material from Snowden existed in lots of places. It existed in New York, because we partnered with the New York Times. It existed in Brazil, because Glenn Greenwald had it. And in Berlin, where Laura Poitras, the US documentary filmmaker, was. But the government wasn't listening, and we ended up with a situation where, I call it in the book, I say it was half Stasi and half pantomime. There was some humor and some kind of darkness together. This crazy symbolic act, we had to do this, and these are my three colleagues who did it. It's quite a hard job smashing up an Apple MacBook Pro. It took about 3 hours, a lot of grinding, a lot of smoke, sweaty, exhausted. This is basically in the car park of the Guardian. And watched by two kind of geeks. We call them the Hobbits.
Yeah, we have a picture of them here.
There they are.
Hobbits,
Okay.
In suits too.
Just to be clear, that we're very careful not to identify anybody. There was a serious point here. We didn't identify anybody at any stage, but one guy to the left, another guy bending down. And what they're doing is, at the end of this kind of smashing up and this kind of crazy deconstruction, they brought along a little box. It looks like a microwave oven. You can see it, called a degausser. It's like a little kid's sort of, plastic thing. And we posted the bits of computer into the degausser so they were demagnetized, like a kid posting plastic shapes. And they're watching to see, waiting for it to go pop. Eventually it does go pop, and that means mission accomplished. But it was a truly chilling episode, I think, for anyone who cares about press freedom. It was also an enjoyable chapter of the book to write.
But the rest of you who worked with the story at that time, did you know about this? Was this something you all knew in newspaper?
No, I mean this whole project was pretty secret. So there was a kind of circle of trust of perhaps 10, 15, 20 people who were kind of in on this. And the number of reporters actually looking at this material was very small.
But was this something that any of you had expected could happen?
No, I mean, who would expect this? I mean, it's not. I mean, I don't want to make any false analogies between Britain and communist East Germany or anything like that, because clearly Britain, for its flaws, is a democracy. But the thing I take away from this is the fact that we, as citizens, we can't be too complacent about our rights. However democratic our government is, however good our media is, that actually we can't fall asleep. We actually have to kind of make sure, because I think this was an example of the government really overstepping the mark.
Yeah, you agree? Yeah, I think they agree. There's one thing that puzzles me. Why didn't you tell the audience, your readers, about this? Because this became public a month later when David Miranda was caught.
Yeah, it's a reasonable question, because we didn't publish this straight away. The kind of discussions with the government were basically done on a confidential basis. And then what happened was that David Miranda, the partner of Glenn Greenwald, was detained at Heathrow Airport, coming back from Berlin, carrying some of the Snowden stuff, which was part of a legitimate journalistic investigation. And this was actually an operation by MI5, the British Security Service. Although they pretended it wasn't their operation, but it was their operation. But the way they did it was to use, instead of going to a judge, which would have been the democratic way of doing it, they used these very sweeping anti-terrorism powers against David Miranda, who clearly wasn't a terrorist. I mean, he was a young Brazilian guy working as Greenwell's journalist assistant. And I think at that point, Alan Rusbridge had decided that whatever informal agreement we had been bust, and that he would reveal this extraordinary story.
How was it to work with these stories when politicians were standing in the parliament accusing you of being traitors? I imagine if that happened here in Norway, I would be really afraid. Were you afraid?
No, I mean, I wasn't afraid at any point, but it felt quite lonely. It was curious because for the first few months, basically, in Britain at least, we were publishing these incredible stories about well, I mean, we'll talk about them later on, but about PRISM, about mass data collection, about surveillance, not of bad guys, but of all of us. And the other newspapers in Britain responded with silence. They just completely ignored the story. Various right-wing conservative politicians said that we'd committed treason, we should be prosecuted or looked at for prosecution. And it felt kind of pretty tough. And so what do beleaguered liberals do in a tight corner? Well, they look to the wider world for international solidarity, and that's what we did. So while the British newspapers were either ignoring us or saying we were traitors, we got support from pretty much everybody, from the New York Times downwards to the Hindu in India, to El País, to Le Monde, to basically saying that what we'd done with Snowden was in the public interest, that there was a serious debate in this kind of age of terrorism between the boundaries of security and privacy, and that we hadn't damaged national security. And so we published all this stuff, and that was kind of made us feel warm. But at the same time, really the debate in Britain has only actually properly taken off, I would say, in the last couple of months.
But what is the current situation for The Guardian? I mean, there have been reports that you are perhaps facing a criminal investigation. And,
yeah. Well, it's not entirely clear, but what we do know is that the Assistant Commissioner of Scotland Yard in December of last year told the British Home Affairs Select Committee that she, in other words, the police, the detectives, were actively investigating some people to see whether they committed any kind of treason or espionage. But we don't know whether some people means David Miranda, whether it means Alan Rusbridge, or whether it means me, whether it means you. It's just not clear what their remit is. But this is ongoing, and there are several politicians who more or less have said they would like to see us in jail.
But if we sum up these two attacks on you, the destruction of the computers and the detention of David Miranda, how did that influence the reporting you did in the following months and weeks?
I think it strengthened our resolve. I mean, we're already pretty, decided and committed to do this. But it made us feel we had to keep publishing, actually. That there was an awful lot at stake. And like I said before, that one can't be complacent about democracy in any country.
I think we should go on to what is one of the main topics in your book, and that's Edward Snowden and his road from being an ordinary person, having an ordinary job, and becoming one of the most wanted persons in the world. What do you think are the main reasons that made him into a whistleblower?
Yeah, I mean, before I answer that, I just explain my role and the role of my colleagues. My colleague, Ewan McCaskill, who's a very senior, very experienced guy, Washington correspondent. He's now back in London. He collaborated on the book, and he basically met Snowden in Hong Kong and spent a week with him, talked to him, sometimes with Glenn Greenwald, sometimes on his own. And so, in a way, the way I portray Snowden in the book is kind of really modulated through what Ewan said. Plus there is some kind of background information as well. But what we know is that Snowden came from the right. He was someone of the right, not someone of the left. He came from a very American tradition, a libertarian tradition. He was from a kind of patriotic family. He was basically a Republican, the kind of Tea Party end of the spectrum. And at one point as a young man, he had this kind of slightly crazy, slightly quixotic plan to go and fight in Iraq. He tried to enlist. That didn't work out at all. And then in his mid-20s, he joined the CIA as a kind of tech guy, an information guy, was posted to Geneva in Switzerland, And I think this is the moment where he started to become disillusioned by what was going on, essentially. This sort of we know what this disillusionment culminated in 4 years later, which was the most spectacular leak of secret intelligence ever.
But was there any certain events that made him lose the illusions?
Yeah, some of it is fuzzy. I mean, some of it Snowden himself hasn't fully explained. Some of it he has explained. I mean, he told Ewan, for example, that a big turning point was Obama. That essentially, even though he wasn't an Obama supporter, Snowden, he thought that when Obama won the presidential election, that he would reverse some of the policies of George Bush. Basically, under George Bush, we'd seen illegal wiretapping, we'd seen the security state, expand massively, and Snowden was expecting Obama, this seemingly reformist liberal president to undo that. And in fact, the reverse happened. The security state grew, and at the same time, Snowden had access to more information. He saw more documents, things like PRISM, and he then decided, he came up with a kind of crazy plan that essentially he couldn't go to his bosses and complain about this stuff because he thought that the internal system was broken. So he decided he would contact journalists, which is what he did.
Here I have a transcript from the Ars Technica pages, which you also write about in your book, where we believe that Snowden played a role under this pseudonym through UA. What did you take out of these chats he was doing? And tell a little bit more about this source.
I mean, basically from about the age of 18, Snowden posted on a kind of forum for geeks, for people who are very, very interested in technology and are very adept at it, called Ars Technica. And he authored almost 800 comments over a period of some years. Initially, he was anti-leaking. He was someone working for the CIA. He was inside the system. I mean, this is kind of, it's very. The best critique I've heard of Snowden, I'm not persuaded by it, is someone I spoke to complained that he was a case of millennial generational entitlement. In other words, there was a kind of arrogance which went with being kind of 25, essentially, and feeling that the internet belonged to him. And I don't think it's just Snowden who felt that. I think there's a whole generation of people who've grown up on the internet who think that too. But here he is complaining anonymously about a leak of classified material. But he changed his mind. I mean, many of these postings are from his early 20s, and obviously he moved from that to a completely different position.
How sure are we that this is a Snowden fact?
My understanding this is Snowden. I mean, there's a kind of one very big clue, which is that about age 23, as the true hoo-ha, he posts a whole series of photos of himself, well, one of which you actually showed, which is clearly him. And also most of these chats, not all of them, I mean, there are one or two which haven't been published, which I referenced in the book, but most of these chats were published last summer, and I think if it were not true by now, he would have repudiated them, which he hasn't.
Are there any of these chats that you think is interesting in order to understand Snowden and his transformation?
They kind of fizzle out. I mean, towards the end, he starts complaining about surveillance. That he posts less frequently. He shifts to Japan. He gets a job with Dell as an NSA contractor, and he has one kind of sardonic posting about 2 years ago where he's mentioning pervasive government surveillance and wondering why people put up with it. And you can see at this point that he feels, I think, internally conflicted and embittered about the system that he's in.
Then you have his helpers, Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras.
And the dog. I see you've got Glenn's dog.
And the dog, yes.
He has a lot of dogs.
I think it's one of the best pictures, which I think describe the situation where you sit there and working through the documents with his dogs all around him. Tell about the Glenn Greenwald.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure he needs much introduction, really. He's a famous guy. He's someone who I kind of write in the book that he's someone who personifies the sort of 21st century debate over what does it mean to be a journalist? Because in America there's a very strong idea that journalists are objective, that they don't have opinions, or at least not in news stories, and that they give due weight to both sides. Whereas Glenn's view is that this is a false equivalence, that if one side is lying and the other side is telling the truth, then if you include both bits, then actually you're kind of not telling the truth either. And he comes from a kind of noisy, big, new digital ecosystem where everybody can be a writer or a publisher, everyone can be a blogger, everyone can tweet. And he kind of invented himself as a writer, first of all for Salon, writing on civil liberties and surveillance. Then he joined The Guardian in 2012. And actually, it was quite a good fit, I think.
And Greenwald was the journalist that Snowden decided to go to. But it almost went wrong in the beginning, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, this is something Greenwald told me when I saw him in Rio, that basically he gets dozens of emails every day. He's a very nice guy in person, but he's totally overworked. So he has 5 chat windows open. His phone rings every 2 minutes. There's a dog jumping on his head. He lives with 15 dogs and his partner and 1 cat. So we got an email from some strange guy saying, "Can you install encryption software so you can have an encrypted chat?" And he said, yeah, I'll do it. And he never did it. And so this guy emails again, and he says, I'm sorry, I haven't got around to it, I'll do it. And he still doesn't do it. And then finally, this mysterious person sends him a kind of an idiot's guide to how to install this video. So he makes a video just for Glenn, shows him how to set up encryption. And Glenn still doesn't do it. And this mysterious person, persistently emailing in December 2012 is Edward Snowden. But it's only 5 months later that Greenwald finds this out.
And then why did he choose Greenwald? I mean, most journalists know would be very...
He chose him for 2 reasons. One, he didn't like the New York Times, although for completely different reasons from the log chats, because he felt the New York Times had sat on a story in 2004 of illegal wiretapping by the Bush administration, which is true. The Times didn't publish it for a year. There was a presidential election, George Bush won, and he thought that was cowardly and wrong. But also, I think quite simply, he was Glenn's reader. He was part of this community of readers who followed his blog, read what he was writing on surveillance and civil liberties, and liked what he read and felt he could trust him.
But in this situation, Laura Poitras come in and she helps the situation.
Yeah, well,
she has played a much bigger role.
Yeah. And the thing about Laura is that Laura's a great filmmaker, a very brilliant woman, when Snowden couldn't get through to Greenwald, he then contacted Laura earlier last year, saying, I am a senior member of the intelligence community. This will not be a waste of your time. And Laura told me that initially she thought maybe this was some kind of plot by the government to trap her, and she was very suspicious. She's quite a suspicious person. But basically she was very good at encryption as well. So they set up a secure channel and they started corresponding. And the more they corresponded, the more she realized that Snowden seemed to be the real deal, seemed to be genuine. And his methods were very unusual. I mean, he told her at one point, "I won't ask anything of you, I will merely tell you things." And then by spring, this whole plan is accelerating. Laura asked for an interview. Snowden hadn't thought about doing that, but he kind of agrees. And then he sends her a note saying, "I need 6 to 8 weeks before I do this." And then eventually she flies to the US thinking that she's going to meet Snowden in the US. And she gets another message saying, "Your destination is Hong Kong." And the following day, another message saying, "My name is Edward Snowden." And I kind of wrote my book like a thriller because it felt like the most appropriate genre for these kind of events. I mean, if you were to submit this to a literary agent as the synopsis for a thriller, he or she would toss it back and say, "Come on, that's just ridiculous." Kind of spies smashing up newspapers and computers in London, encrypted chats, mysterious assignments halfway around the world. I mean, it is quite astonishing, but it's all true.
But to make that completely clear, The Guardian would never have gotten into this story if it wasn't for Greenwald and Poitras, and how would you describe your relationship to Greenwald today? I mean, he quit and left you.
Yeah, that's a mean question, isn't it? Well, I mean, I kind of, Glenn's just launched this new venture. He's been backed by the billionaire founder of eBay, and they published 2 very good articles this week. And I wish him well. I think, he still writes for us, and I think essentially we're on the same page, even if our methods are different. But we kind of knew that when the Guardian took him on, that he was someone who often, kind of shoots first and thinks afterwards. But the important thing about Glenn is that even though he comes across as being very combative, very fierce, very sardonic, what he writes is grounded in fact and data and verifiable evidence. In other words, I mean, he's a lawyer, he's an ex-lawyer. In other words, there's a kind of solidity to his reporting, which I think is very, very impressive.
I will be a little bit more, because I saw one of these tweets from Greenwald about your book, and it said the inside story of Edward Snowden by someone who never met or spoke with Edward Snowden. It seems like you have a little quarrel going on, perhaps because he's coming with a book very soon too, and you have taken half of the market already.
Well, I mean, as a journalist who asks cheeky questions, I appreciate your cheeky question. Basically, and between ourselves, so please don't tweet.
I will not tell anyone.
No, don't tweet, guys. Don't tweet this bit. But basically, Glenn sent that tweet before he'd read the book, and now he's read the book. He quite likes it, and he doesn't have any major quibbles with it. So this is what I'm told. So I think it was sent in error.
Yeah. Let's go to Hong Kong, because that's where Snowden went. And as you point out in your book, there are many people who are asking many questions about the black holes in the timeline of Snowden. Tell about that.
Yeah. I mean, incidentally, Ewan McCaskill took that photo there in the middle. That was my colleague Ewan who took that, and it's quite interesting because Ewan said that basically he took a few photos with his iPhone, and Snowden kind of flinched. This is not a guy who sought celebrity. This wasn't someone who wanted to be famous or rich or on every front page around the world. It was someone who had a kind of very clear strategic goal, which was to release this material for what he thought was essentially kind of idealistic reasons, human rights reasons. But we know when Snowden arrived in Hong Kong, we know that Ewan and Glenn and Laura spent a week with him, that during these kind of febrile, crazy days. I mean, The Guardian published the first Snowden story on June the 5th, which was about Verizon, the US telecoms company, which was secretly gathering everybody's data up. So that was story number 1. Then came Prism, and it was an incredible week. And then basically, Snowden outed himself in this extraordinary video, which I'm sure you've all seen, which was on the Sunday night. And then basically the whole world was hunting for him, intelligence agencies, journalists, practically everybody. And so he went into hiding for a couple of weeks. And this is the kind of gap in the timeline. I mean, I did talk to his Hong Kong lawyer and say, look, what happened? And the Hong Kong lawyer merely said, it's complicated. But he wouldn't tell me. So I asked the question, but I didn't get an answer. So it was complicated. But we know he was, staying with a benefactor in Hong Kong. And at some point, WikiLeaks got in touch with him. Sarah Harrison, WikiLeaks journalist, came out to Hong Kong. And incredibly, he managed to escape the CIA, get on a flight, and end up in Moscow. The plan was to go to Latin America, but he never made it.
This mysterious guardian angel, what do we know about him, which helped?
Not much. Not much. We just know that he had a kind of contact, basically, and the contact arranged his kind of accommodation and his hiding place. But we also, I mean, I haven't got to the bottom of this either, but Ewan, at one point, tried to get in touch with him. I mean, the Guardian actually helped arrange lawyers for Snowden in Hong Kong. WikiLeaks puts out this story that we abandoned him. We didn't. We got him legal representation and were trying to support him. But at one point, the message came from the lawyers that he'd had a close call. In other words, he'd very nearly been got. But again, the exact circumstances are not clear.
This is the front page from The Guardian, the day he went forward. One of the people that has engaged in the debate was Bob Woodward, who was, of course, envy on you for getting the files, but he said that he was so sorry that Snowden didn't went to him, because he would have advised Snowden to stay behind, to not go forward with his identity. Was that a smart move to go out?
I think what Snowden did was super smart, actually. And really, from his kind of earliest chats with Laura Poitras, he was making it clear that he intended to reveal himself as the source of these incredible leaks, principally because he was worried about the damage that it might cause to his family, in particular to his friends and to his colleagues, because he knew there would be a very thorough, a very vicious NSA inquiry to find this mole if he didn't come forward. And a lot of people would be sucked into it and their lives would be turned upside down, and he didn't want that to happen. But also, I just think strategically it was a clever thing to do, because in a way it gave new momentum to the story. It became a bit of a soap opera, but it also made people focus on what he was actually revealing and whether it was important and legitimate.
But hasn't it also taken away the momentum from the content of the files? I mean, now we're talking about the Snowden files. It's just like an echo of what happened with WikiLeaks, where suddenly we spoke more about Julian Assange than the content of the
cables. I haven't met Snowden. I haven't met Julian Assange. Ewan McCaskill's met Snowden and helped me with this book. Snowden is not Julian Assange. They're very different insofar as, to a degree they share a kind of mistrust of government surveillance, of the overreach of the national security state, of Anglophone spying. So there are some, ideological similarities, if you want to put it like that. But in terms of temperament, they're completely different. I met Julian a couple of times when I was working on these WikiLeaks documents in 2011. I actually quite liked him. But he is someone who really sees the world in quite Manichean terms. Either you support him personally and WikiLeaks completely, or you don't. And if you don't, then you're an enemy. And we started off as being friends. Julian fell out with us, and now every morning I look at my Twitter feed and there's kind of abuse from Julian. It's like a kind of morning greeting, basically. He says I'm anti-Russian. He says my book is a cuts job. He called for a boycott of this book, even though he hadn't read it. So I don't know.
But the reason why they want to boycott the book is some of your comments about the situation of Snowden in Russia right now. Because you ask whether he in fact is some kind of in prison. So what do you mean by that?
I don't use the word in prison, although that was put on the headline of the extract of the book. That wasn't my word. But
it was the desk, yeah?
It was the desk. Yeah. It's always the desk. But I think you have to acknowledge that Snowden's situation is complicated. I mean, you've got to start from the premise that, in my view, Snowden did something heroic, that he's a whistleblower, that this was a solo operation. There's no evidence I have seen which persuades me that this was a Russian plot stretching back years to kind of blow up the CIA or the NSA. I don't think that's true. I also believe Snowden when he says that he hasn't handed this material to the Russians. I think that's right. But the reality is he got stuck in Moscow and that's where he remains. And this is the problem. I mean, I write in the book that it made his narrative, his story of, I call it principled exile, a lot more complicated because on the one hand it exposed, I think, mass surveillance by the USA and UK. But on the other hand, he's now stuck in this rather gloomy, authoritarian state run by someone who used to be in the KGB and who believes in KGB methods, and I think really has a worldview of Soviet xenophobia, especially towards America. So it's a kind of paradoxical situation. So where WikiLeaks criticised me because I think one has to be very careful. But I think the situation is that Snowden has no interest in the Russian security services. He's not a traitor, absolutely. But that doesn't mean the Russian security services are not interested in him. Because of course they are. Of course they are.
But Snowden has said that he didn't bring the documents with him. He gave them to two persons, Gloria Patras and Glenn Greenwald, and he has hidden the rest. Do you believe he has documents with him?
No, I don't believe that. I mean, because basically he planned everything out. I mean, he spent 4 years preparing for this leak, and the incredible thing is that it all worked. He left Hong Kong with this material. No one stopped him. The NSA didn't notice when he was taking this material, and his plan was to bring these journalists to Hong Kong, spread this material out, and that was it. And for him, it was kind of mission accomplished at this point. And actually, it also went to Barton Gellman from the Washington Post. So the Washington Post was involved, the Guardian was involved, Glenn Greenwald was involved, Laura Poitras was involved. So that was his plan, to turn this material over to journalists, not tell them what to publish, let them exercise their own editorial judgment. And that's precisely what happened. So there was no logical reason for him to take the stuff to Russia. And just one last thing on that. I mean, he was someone who we now know was a specialist in China. He specialized in cyber defense. He taught courses in how to defend your material, secret material, from hostile intelligence agencies. So he knew what he was doing, and I think he would have been very careful.
But in your own parliament in Britain, people say that, well, everything that we've seen from the files is against the West, against the Western democracy. It must be some kind of a conspiracy going on. You don't see any...
I mean, the thing is, let's put it this way, I am no fan of the Putin regime. Okay, I have my own kind of I have experience of the FSB, and I have my own slightly kind of comic, slightly awful backstory, So if this were the case, I'd be the first person to say so, but I just don't see it. I mean, I think if it were a Russian plot, I mean, I'm not Vladimir Putin. I don't really want to look inside his head, although as Moscow correspondent, you have to kind of do that exercise sometimes. But I think they would have preferred to keep him in play. In other words, have him as a mole inside the NSA passing out secret material. Now, that didn't happen. I mean, I'm just not persuaded by the evidence at all.
Do you think we ever could get the Russian Snowden?
Well, there was a Russian Snowden. He was called Alexander Litvinenko.
He didn't have access to the same data, did he?
He had some data. He wasn't as senior. I mean, I know Marina Litvinenko, Alexander Litvinenko's widow, very well. I didn't meet Alexander Litvinenko, but he had some sensitive material for sure. And he had some useful contacts, and we know that he was on the payroll of both the British and the Spanish security services. But we also know that he ended up dead in what I think was pretty clearly a kind of Russian state assassination.
So the message to the whistleblowers in Russia is that don't do it. You will get.
Well, I mean, let's be serious here. Look at what happens to investigative journalists in Russia. It's a very dangerous profession. There's some very brave people, human rights defenders, journalists, opposition people, the bravest people I've ever met in Russia. People like Anna Politkovskaya, who we know. While I was there, I met Natasha Estemirova, who was another great human rights activist working in Chechnya, who was kidnapped in Grozny and murdered in 2009. That's the reality for whistleblowers in Russia.
What do you think the Russian government, Russian FBS, has been thinking when they have been reading all these files coming out? Do you think they have been surprised and thinking, oh, they are able to do all those things that we are not able to do? I mean,
well, Vladimir Putin said, "Oh, if only we had the power the Americans have." Yeah. But this was Putin being sardonic again. I mean, because when I was there, my email was hacked. I don't think that. I don't know, because there's very little real information about the FSB. I don't think they have the same technological capacities as the NSA in terms of global collection, but in terms of penetrating Russian networks, collecting Russian data, and then targeting people in the opposition, human rights activists, etc. I mean, they can do all that, and there's no oversight whatsoever in Russia.
I think we should go into the content of the files now. I guess that must have been a difficult question for you when you write the book. You know, how much kiss and tell, how much personal Snowden stories, and how much should you spend on?
Yeah. I mean, I tried to kind of
issues.
balance it so that it worked coherently.
I asked you before, what do you think has been the single most important stories from all those hundreds of big news that has come out of the files so long?
I mean, there were so many. There were so many brilliant stories, important stories, which I think are in the public interest. Maybe I just mentioned two. One, I think, is Tempora, which is basically, that was one of the ones that I worked on, that we discovered that these fiber optic cables from America, which land in the UK and then shoot out to the whole of continental Europe, including Norway, to Ireland, to Holland, Germany, that from about 2007, 2008, they've been hacked by the NSA and GCHQ, who are essentially are just taking everybody's data. We're talking about billions of data items a day. They've developed this new capacity to kind of buffer this data and to store it and to sift it.
Explain that a little bit more, because most of people here, when we send out an email, it means that it goes in the fiber cables.
Yeah. It doesn't mean, this does not mean there is some British spy with a copy of the Times newspaper and a photo of the Queen, reading your email. Of course not. But it does mean that all of this electronic information is collected and then sifted using a series of complex algorithms to see whether you flash any kind of red lights. So quietly, without any proper public debate or acknowledgement, the spy agencies have done what Snowden called suspicionless surveillance. In other words, instead of just taking the data of bad guys, they take everybody's data from civilians. It's sort of non-targeted. So we discovered that basically all the fiber optic networks had been compromised. And the other really important story, I think, is the story about encryption. These days, you log onto your bank, it's encrypted. All sorts of stuff is routinely encrypted, and essentially the NSA and GCHQ have been trying to kind of break encryption. One way it's actually very hard to do. So what they've done is they've cheated. They've introduced all sorts of backdoors into commercial products. We don't know which ones, to weaken encryption so they can get in. And the reason that's important is, if they can get in, other people can get in. Hackers can get in. The Chinese can get in. And so basically they've weakened the whole infrastructure of the internet for everybody, which to me just seems crazy.
But the first story that the Guardian and Greenwald ran was the Verizon story. And why did you choose especially that story? Two
reasons. For those who don't know, this is about taking telephony. Basically, who called who in the United States. Verizon was secretly being compelled to hand all of this material of every single American phone call to the NSA. We published that first because it was a very easy to understand document. We can go on to talk about this, but some of these documents are very technical. This was a simple one, written in English, rather than a kind of robot language that some of them are written in. And also because it just seemed very important. And the interesting thing is that the whole response from the White House, last month Barack Obama stood up for an hour and made a speech, quite a major speech on reform of the NSA. But the first thing he said was that actually the NSA would no longer collect this American telephone data. It would go to some new entity. So I think probably, in a way, it was the most important story we published.
And another big story was, of course, the boundless informant. For me personally, that was one of the big stories, since it, of course, inflicted the rest of the world. What can you say about that?
Well, all I would say, because it's quite a technical document, is this is the amount of data collection from countries around the world. It's concentrated in Iran, Pakistan, Jordan, something like that. I would just say, look at the numbers in the top left-hand column, and this gives you some idea of volumes.
But when you were working with Guardian on the cables, what would you say was the biggest challenges when you were trying to understand these documents?
Well, the book is quite a breezy book, and I say at one point it was like looking at Assyrian tablets, where you didn't understand the hieroglyphics. Just the sheer the program names. I mean, the American program names tended to be quite serious. They were very stern. Boundless informant, this kind of thing. Whereas the British names were more playful, sometimes named after pop songs or whatever. They were called things like Bad Piggy, and they had quite the names were a lot stranger, and it was just trying to understand this lexicon. And what actually helped us in this process was that one of the things that Snowden downloaded was the kind of internal wiki. If that makes sense, it's a bit like Wikipedia, the internal wiki for GCHQ, which is kind of written in English. And that helped us to understand some of these programs, which are very complicated, what they did, and so on. I mean, we got better at it, but initially it was like, I don't know, I mean, it was like, I don't know if you know the Rosetta Stone. It's a famous stone in the British Museum in London with ancient Egyptian and Greek written on it. It was almost like staring at that.
But what was the worst cases? What was you afraid of when you were working with the stories? What could go wrong?
Well, an awful lot could go wrong, and also, to be fair, we had very clear guidelines. I mean, Alan Musburger, the editor, in the secret bunker on the 4th floor of the Guardian, had written, "This is not a fishing expedition. We are looking for material which is in the public interest and which shows evidence of illegality or essentially kind of mass surveillance." So those are the stories we were looking for, and actually that was the material we published. So the bar was very, very high to actually publish something. It had to be absolutely didn't damage legitimate intelligence gathering and did say something about the whole surveillance debate.
But from a journalistic point of view, what's wrong with fishing? Isn't that what we have?
What, you mean you might get an interesting fish?
You might find something you didn't know was there.
Well, yeah, but we had to be very careful. I mean, we were mindful that these were top secret documents, and that we couldn't really treat them with, with kind of levity. I mean, there are stories we talked about doing which we didn't do, which I can't tell you about. But I mean, we published perhaps 1%, maybe less than 1% of the material we had.
But one of the things that surprised people with the boundless informant stories was that, in fact, they were capable of gathering so much data from so many countries and even analyzing it. Can you tell something more about the analyzing system that makes this information valuable for NSA, for the British?
Well, it's quite complex, but we know, for example, one document that he leaked that in April 2013 there were about 120,000 active surveillance targets. In other words, the NSA was specifically targeting the data of 120,000 people. But we know, I mean, just on a more basic level, I mean, this thing, the iPhone, I mean, there's one document boasting of how NSA has basically cracked the iPhone and turned it into this glorious spying device. There's a slide published by Der Spiegel of Steve Jobs holding this thing. And another of the people who buy iPhones, this is a top secret NSA document describing them as zombies, basically, because we're all fools. We all carry these things around. And with an iPhone, you can take people's geodata, so where they've been, you can look at their web searches, you can read their emails, you can take their selfies, you can even turn it into an audio device. So you can activate it and listen in on what people are saying. And the thing is, this all sounds quite crazy, apart from the fact we've seen the documents, so we know it's true.
But another challenge must have been that, I mean, when you were going into the prison documents, you could not just call some experts and send the document to them and get help as you would do in ordinary journalistic work.
Well, actually that's not true, because PRISM, for example, was about the fact that the NSA was claiming it had direct access into Google, Yahoo, Silicon Valley, and so on. And actually what we did was we just did old-fashioned journalism. We saw this, and then we called up all the tech companies and said, hey, did you know the NSA was hacking all of your data? And they went, what? No, of course not. How can that be? This is wrong. And so there was this wave of panic that kind of rippled down from the CEO of Google down to everybody else. And they denied all this and said, no, they just comply with legal requirements. no more than that. So yeah, I mean, we did try and put these stories to the relevant people. We did talk to government. We did engage with the White House, with the agencies and so on before publication. So there was a dialogue of sorts, but it was never a very happy dialogue.
I think that was a story that at least engaged my kids most.
Yeah.
You know, that Facebook, Google, or Skype, all those places where the kids.
Yeah, it's also I just quite like it aesthetically. If you look up at the slide, you can see little, Yahoo with an exclamation mark, Facebook, Apple. They're sort of I say that they're sort of fluttering like so many colourful butterflies at the top of this top secret slide. I mean, the Prism actually looks a bit like the Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon album from the 1970s.
Since we are so lucky to have you here, Luke, I thought you could perhaps help us understand the Norwegian slide.
You're so mean. I knew you were going to do the Norwegian slide at me, weren't you? You were just going to bring me into your intra-Norwegian quarrels. It's just kind of.
No, I'm just envy. But this is the slide that Dagbladet got from Greenwald, showing that that NSA got 33 million records from Norway. And they said that it was Norwegian phone calls, and after a few hours, the Norwegian intelligence said that no, this was from Afghanistan. What do you think about that?
Okay, well, firstly, I haven't. This was Glenn's document. I haven't seen this document, so whatever I say is kind of provisional. But I don't know about whether this document has been interpreted correctly, but I think if we take a step back, what we do know is that the NSA's ambition is to capture everybody's data, in other words, the whole planet's data, and to store it, and if need be, to kind of go through it retrospectively. So in Germany, for example, they're taking all German data. A lot of people in Germany, it's all being sucked up. And now there are questions about how complicit European spy agencies are in this. The White House is basically suggesting that they are very complicit. In other words, they work closely with the NSA, and we know that's the case in Norway. But to be honest, if the NSA is taking all of German data and French data and Spanish data, it seems to me most unlikely they would not be taking Norwegian data. But maybe you're very special, and part of this.
But many Norwegians.
I mean, obviously you are very special, but
So what would you say to Norwegians who think that this doesn't affect us?
I think they need to read my book.
Okay. And after you've done that.
Well, maybe reflect.
Another big story.
Yeah, you see, here's another dissatisfied NSA customer, right? I think the slide speaks for itself, really. Yeah.
Many commentators said that this was perhaps the biggest story of all, since it really inflected the relationship between Merkel or United States, or has it really affected anything?
Well, yeah, I was, before I went to Moscow, I was in Berlin as the correspondent there, covering Europe for 4 years, so I speak German, I know Germany. I think this was, in a way, this is probably the biggest story because it was the easiest to understand. That Germany and the US, not only are they close transatlantic partners, but German soldiers are fighting and dying in Afghanistan together with the Americans. And yet Angela Merkel's phone has been hacked, and we suspect, although we don't know for sure, we suspect Gerhard Schröder's phone was hacked by the Americans before. So, and the other thing is, of course, Obama has now announced last month that he will no longer spy on Angela Merkel's phone. That he won't spy on the phones, or the NSA will not spy on the phones of close friends and allies. So how close a friend is Norway? I don't know, you tell me. If you're very close, you're fine. If you're not so close, then maybe you are spied on, I don't know. But so this is a huge story. I mean, the Germans have their own special history. They had not one but two totalitarian moments in the 20th century, and understandably they care deeply about privacy, and that they know why it's important. And so, but of course, at the end of the day, transatlantic relations are more important than this story. They're more important about Edward Snowden getting asylum, and of course, Merkel is a superlative pragmatist, and I think, I wouldn't say business as usual, but I think obviously she knows that she has to keep this relationship going.
This story was run by Laura Patras in the Spiegel. Do you have an idea why this story ended up there and why?
Yeah,
it could have been Guardian, couldn't it?
Because Spiegel hired Laura.
Yeah. So it was a coincidence in a way. Yeah.
No, they hired her. I mean, she's been collaborating with them on journalistic projects.
But you would have liked to have this in the Guardian, I guess.
Well, I mean, obviously we'd like to have everything in the Guardian, but but it's a big cake, and we had quite a large slice, so I think it's okay.
If we go back to not this
Oh,
slide.
not the Norwegian slide again.
I just want to make some connections to Norway, because why should we believe that we are influenced by this? Is there any other arguments from the Snowden files that you mean should make Norwegians aware that we are also being watched in a?
Well, I mean, merely to restate what we've said already, that their ambition now is to capture everything. I mean, one of the General Alexander, the current head of the NSA, on a visit to the UK and 4 or 5 times, four or 5 years ago, said in one of the documents I saw that this huge listening station, it's actually in Yorkshire and Menwith Hill, that it would be a good idea for them to get all of the signals all of the time. In other words, the ambition is total. It's may not be total surveillance. It depends on how you define surveillance, but it's certainly total collection, the collection of all, more or less all electronic material which may be useful at some point.
The big question now is, of course, what more can we expect from the Snowden files? What more is there? I checked the figures from today, and now 1,114 documents have been published. It means about 1.8%. And if the American Defense Department is right, that about 1.7 million documents have leaked.
I'm not persuaded by that figure. I mean, I don't know what the true figure is, but I think that figure is high.
But you still think there are big stories that will move us in the coming months? And
I think the most important revelations we've had already, for sure. But there will be more stories. There was a very good story on Monday by Glenn Greenwald about drone strikes, about the fact the Americans were essentially relying on mobile phone to identify where they fired their rockets. And of course, these mobile phones are passed around. You know, it may not be the target, it may be their cousin. Their cousin may be, with his wife and 5 children, etc. That basically they were not relying on human intelligence on the ground, they were doing it electronically, which meant that the chances of killing the wrong person was significantly higher. That was a very important story, and that just came out. So, there will be more stuff.
But that story reminded very much about a very good story we had in Aftenposten before Christmas. Because
Aftenposten always has very good stories.
Yeah, but that was the whole point with these slides. It showed that Norwegian intelligence was giving a huge amount of data that was used in the drone war.
I mean, that's right. So even if you say the Norwegian intelligence are telling the truth and always tell the truth, then in a way there are questions about whether they should be cooperating in what essentially is kind of, it seems to me, extrajudicial killing.
But do you think Norwegians has a right to know whether our government is killing people in other countries and why we're killing them?
Well, I think it would be impolite for me as a British citizen who arrived in Oslo last night to tell the Norwegian Prime Minister what to do. But I mean, I do think there's a case for a proper public discussion of this, yes.
But what kind of stories do you think we should expect? I think here are the latest I found from NBC News this week. There is something from J-Trig. It's one of the most aggressive surveillance agencies about how they set up honey traps, how you can stop somebody from communicating. It's really scary documents.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen this one. I'd rather not comment on this one for reasons I'd rather go to privately. Yeah, I mean, not that there's anything, there's no wrong backstory or whatever, but it's I mean, it's an interesting story, but it's not a story we published.
What about Snowden himself? What will happen to him?
Well, briefly, because I think we should probably take up the questions.
Yeah.
I think he's stuck, basically, because the Americans have basically said no clemency. The Europeans, the Norwegians, the Germans have said we're terribly outraged, but actually we're not going to give Edward Snowden asylum, because they know that the price in terms of transatlantic relations would just be too high. So the reality is, for better or worse, he's stuck in Moscow. And I actually finished my book by saying no one knew how long his exile would last months, question mark, years, question mark, decades. But my sense is it'll be a longer time rather than a shorter time.
Well, thank you very much, Luke.
Thank you. Yeah.